Welcome to a new episode of the Mentors Office podcast. In today's episode, we welcome Bismarck Lepe. Bismarck is the founder and the CEO of Wizeline and a serial entrepreneur. Wizeline is one of the world's fastest growing global technology services providers, and it is focused on AI. The company has important clients such as Fox, Disney, Google, Nike, and Stripe. He's also a founder and chairman of the health technology company Mi Salud. Mi Salud offers a cost effective and Spanish language digital health and wellness solution. The company offers its services in the United States and in Mexico. Bismarck is board member for Servi, Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey, Guadalajara, Farmacias del Ahorro, and the investment committee of Proesa Ventures. Prior to this, he founded Uyula and was its CEO, where he drove product strategy, grew the team, and raised $20 million on the way to being acquired by Telstra in 2014 for over $400 million. He worked at Google when it only had 200 employees. In Google, he worked in various product capacities. Bismarck, welcome to a Mentors Office podcast. It's a
Hello.
pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm also an entrepreneur, so I'm really excited about this topic and learning more about you and your experience as an entrepreneur.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So let's start with how did you get and evaluate the idea to start Wizeline?
So we had already decided that we were going to sell Uyala, and the transaction was on its way. And so I started thinking about what I was going to do next. And initially, I thought about um, like a medical device that could analyze your blood, potentially even administer drugs, a little bit like the Theranos original idea. And then I realized I don't know anything about hardware. I didn't really know a lot about the medical industry. So I'm like, oh, let me go and solve a problem that I've had before. And one of the things that I saw at both Google and Uyala was that as the company got to a certain size, it became harder and harder to build products for markets. You ended up building products for the loudest person in the room. Could have been someone representing the biggest customer. It could have been someone with the biggest title. And so we decided to build a SaaS platform called Wizeline, wisdom of crowd. So taking in data from many different sources and then drawing the line above and below the line. Eventually, the business evolved into digital services. But when it first started out, it was to go and solve a problem that we had building companies.
And how did you evaluate it? So how did you know that it was a good business? Did you have any frameworks to that?
No real frameworks. It was just based on personal experience and something that I knew was happening. Between 60 and 90% of software development goes to waste and features that aren't sold, aren't used, are never completed. And so I figured, hey, as more companies become software companies, as software eats the world, then this is a problem that more and more companies are going to have, and therefore it could be a really interesting opportunity.
How did you find your co-founders and the initial team? How did that process work?
So for this one, I didn't have a co-founder per se. Typically co-founders, you start, everybody has the same amount of equity. Uh, when we started Wizeline, I started with a founding group. So it was, five different employees that joined me, all of whom had worked at Uyala, and they got a bigger share of equity than they would have gotten if they were just regular employees, but they didn't get founder shares.
Okay. And what about the initial team? Did you recruit from Uyala or also prior
Yeah, they're
with
all
people
they're
that
all
you know at
people that I
Google?
had worked with at Uyala.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. And well, one of the big challenges that an entrepreneur has, especially when starting the company, is finding the first customers. How did you find those first customers? What was the story?
Well, one should always go and sell to the people who already know and trust you. It's a little bit, the when you think about starting a company, a lot of people talk about investments, right? And the first round of investments come from the friends, family, and fools, right? Because the friends and family know you. And if you're someone who should receive capital, then they're obviously going to invest in you because they know you well. Obviously, there may be some entrepreneurs that come from underprivileged areas where they may not have friends and family who will invest in them with capital because they don't have it. But for the most part, your friends and family know you, and therefore they're the ones who should be willing to invest in you. The fools are people who don't know you and still give you money. And it may be great for them, but it is, um, there's a lot of risk in that. And so the same thing is true when you're hiring someone, right? Like the friends and family are people who know you. And although they're not investing money, they are investing their time with you. And the same thing is true with customers and friends and family, people who know you, people who have worked with you are more interested or willing to place a bet and that you have something interesting for them and for their company. And so when we started Wizeline, we went and sold to all of the people that who already knew us that we had sold into at Uyala. One of the funny things about Uyala was we were one of the first group of entrepreneurs that left Google. And so everybody that we knew was still at Google. But by the time we started Wizeline 7 years later, there were a lot of people who had already left and gone to different companies. And so we also picked up the phone and said, hey, we're starting a new company. This is what it does. Obviously, you have a software team. Can we just show you what we're doing? We'd love your feedback.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a really good idea, and also something similar that I did. My first customers were family or friends in my case. So,
That's right.
and was it hard in the case of Wizeline to get those first customers, or how do you
Um,
remember that?
yes, but I don't think it was any harder than almost any other thing that I've tried to sell. Like I don't think that first customer was that much harder than the 10th customer because until you become a brand name, like you still have to convince people. It's like, yeah, you should use it. Or sometimes if they're really close friends, they may buy it, they may sign a small contract, but then no one at the company uses it. And so you have to go and evangelize. So even after you sign the contract, you want to make sure that people are seeing value and that you're on all the customer support threads so you know how and where the product should evolve.
Right, right. But I imagine that because it was a business to business company, sometimes it's really hard to sell to businesses, right? That I had experience in sales for businesses, and it's harder than with people. Let's say, like the process, the time they take to make a decision to purchase is it's longer, right?
I think about the time value of money, right? If you're selling a $1 thing, well, to get the $10,000, you're gonna have to sell 10,000 of them. Or if you're selling enterprise software and you just sell one license, then I don't know. I think it really depends on the individual and the product that you have. But I'd rather sell one thing at $10,000 and try to sell 10,000 things at $1.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to ask you one question related to to a start, and is what were the most challenging things that you had to deal with in the beginning of Wizeline? Many of people work at Wizeline, but they don't really imagine how hard it is to be an entrepreneur.
Um, I think, and starting Wizeline, I think setting the culture is hard, but then it's also even if you have the best intentions, and even if you're very open and transparent, like people are always going to assume the worst. Not everyone, but there are going to be a lot of people who are going to assume the worst. Uh, and in places like in emerging countries, not just Mexico, but in kind of the emerging world, where a lot of the big businesses have been family run, there's always been this idea of the owner and the worker, right? It's less so in the US, because in the US, I think um, there's I think more meritocracy. There are very few family-run businesses, like especially that achieve a certain level of scale compared to the emerging world, and so it's actually rare when to find the CEO and executive whose last name is the same as on the building. Where across Latin America, usually the executives are family members, right? Like their last name is on the building, and so I can understand that there's a certain reluctance to trust, um, but building that culture of trust and that we are all on the same page and that we're all in the same boat and we're all trying to build something successful, it takes time, and you can't just say it. You have to prove it with actions.
And what was your secret in this case to solve this challenge? It was using stocks or stock options, or what was the secret?
um, there's definitely that, so stock options, but there are little things like, and I think last time I was in Colombia, we talked about this. We one is a product of their experience, and I was formed professionally at Google. And at Google, you gave breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and there was always beer in the fridge, and there was a certain expectation that you knew how to behave, right? Like you didn't that fully formed adults were hired, that they didn't need to be babysat. Well, at Uyala, we had the same philosophy. So we didn't have a set time schedule when people were supposed to arrive or leave from work, people would work all night, and there would always be alcohol in the fridge. Perfect. At Wizeline, because our big concentration of staff was in Latin America, they didn't have the benefit of coming to the Silicon Valley and seeing how things were done. And so, but in the same way, we had beautiful campus, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a lot of flexibility around how people work, and alcohol in the fridge. So our CTO one day came. He's like, "Oh, we have a big problem. Some people, they're like getting into work at 11. Maybe they'll do some work. Maybe they'll go to the gym, and then they'll go to lunch and have like 5 or 6 beers." And they probably take a nap, because after 5 or 6 beers, you're probably going to need to take a nap. Then they leave at 4:30. He's like, "Do you want me to put a lock on the fridge?" I'm like, "No." Like again, we want to show them that, like, if Wizeline does well, they will do well. Like if we succeed and we work hard, we all succeed because we worked hard. I'm like, no, we want to make sure that people know that this exists because Wizeline does well. And so over time, we started showing people that we trusted them and that we weren't going to babysit them. And eventually, like the culture started protecting itself. Like individuals be like, "Hey, man, you've had 2 beers. Like, I think you need to put a stop on it." It wasn't anybody from the executive team; it was their own peers who were saying, like, "Hey, let's slow it down a bit, like, or let's get back to work instead of continuing drinking at lunchtime." And so I'm a big believer in actions. Like anybody can talk, anybody can have nice phrases on the walls, but it's about the actions and how you deliver.
I want to move forward in the history of Wizeline. In 2018, Wizeline reached a milestone that was raising $43 million in a Series B round. How challenging it was, and how were you able to accomplish that? Can you give tips to other entrepreneurs about fundraising, such as me? That was a topic that for me was very hard and that I didn't understand well when I did my company.
So again, friends, family, and fools. And so when we started Wiseline, we did a seed round with people that we knew. And we were able to raise about 1.7, $1.9 million pretty quickly with people, some people who had invested in Uyala and had made money from Uyala, other venture capital funds that we knew some of the partners that we had worked with at Google. So we raised that round pretty quickly, pretty easily. And again, it was this idea of a platform that would help companies decide which features they should add um, to their software stack. We raised our Series A under the same thesis of what we were doing. But then between our Series A and Series B, that's when we expanded into services, and services started to grow. And the thing with services is services you don't raise from venture capital funds. And so I knew that I needed to fund the company until we got to a certain size. And I figured at about $15 million of annual revenue, you'd be able to go out and raise capital from an investor. And so in the summer of 2017, we knew we were approaching kind of that $15 million revenue run rate threshold. And I started talking to a handful of investors. And most of the investors I knew came from the venture capital space, and all of them basically said no. It's like, no, we only invest in product companies. We don't invest in services. Damn. But then I received an inbound from this guy who worked for a private equity fund, Apex, and specifically Apex Digital. And he reached out. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll talk to you, because typically these big funds, they have like analysts and associates and principals, like the various levels. And the analysts are the ones that are looking for companies because they're looking for deal flow. And they're dialing for dollars, basically trying to find interesting companies to present to the associates, to present to the principals. And then you have the general partners that kind of run the fund. And we get on the phone. I'm like, hey, just want to be very clear. The company is a hybrid product and services, but really it's a services business that's driving the majority of our revenue. Just want to be very clear, but because I don't want to waste my time, I don't want to waste your time. He's like, no, we're one of the preeminent services investors. They had recently acquired ThoughtWorks. They had invested in a company called Solita. They had bought and sold Global Logic, which was a huge success for them. Like, we know the services space. I'm like, oh, interesting. He's like, send me some information on the company. I'll discuss with the team. I'm like, no. Get me on the phone with someone who can make a decision about potentially investing in Wizeline, and then we'll send some information. And so we scheduled a follow-up meeting the following week with this guy named Brian Gartner, who's no longer at Apex, and he was the principal. So he reported into the general partner. He could make investment decisions. And we spoke, we were on the phone. He was really excited about the deal. He said, hey, next time you're in New York, we'd love to meet you. And it just happened that 2 weeks later, we were going to be in New York. So my head of sales, one of the person that was kind of running the product of this platform was going to be there. And we go and we have this meeting. We start the meeting with the principal and the analyst. After 20 minutes, it was supposed to be a 30-minute meet and greet. He's like, let me bring in Marcelo. And Marcelo was the founder of Apex Digital. Not the founder of Apex, but Apex Digital. So he comes in and we're chatting for the next hour and a half. He's Argentinian. I got married with my wife in Argentina. Like, we just clicked. And he asked me about expectations. I'm like, we're expecting kind of a $20 million revenue run rate by the end of the year. And so like 6x multiple, $120 million valuation. And then that evening, he emailed me and said, hey, great meeting. I think we can get there. And I told him, like, oh, that's great. But before you send a term sheet, I want you to come down to our offices in Guadalajara, because I want you to see the culture and the special place that we've built. He was like, all right, we'll go down there. And so it was really funny because they flew down the week of Thanksgiving, and I wasn't aware of this, but typically the Monday of the week of Thanksgiving in Mexico is Revolution Day. And so it's a holiday. And so here come these big investors, and they show up to this office and it's just empty. Like
No.
you just see a bunch of computer monitors. And I don't know if you ever saw the movie Boiler Room, like when they walk into the office and they just see a bunch of
No.
like empty phones. I'm like, he's going to think that we're just some money laundering operation. But it was going to be, they were going to be there for 2 days. So the next day that they came into the office, like the office was full. And that evening, when I was flying back to San Francisco, uh, I received an email. It's like, hey, you'll get a term sheet before you sit down for dinner on Thanksgiving.
Well, that is, well, very, very interesting. Would you say that raising money for Wizeline was easier than for Uyula? Now that you were like a
Uh,
more established entrepreneur?
yes and no. I had I knew more people with money, which is good because between our Series A and Series B, we had to raise a convertible note. Again, because we had had success with Google and Uyala, like I self-funded the company for a year or two, and put a lot of money into the business. And then I also had a lot of other friends that invested in a convertible note as we were funding the business. So that was that was easier per se, but the thing with Uyala, we raised our seed very quickly, very easily. We raised our Series A very quickly, very easily. And then we were, the summer of 2008, this was for Uyala, we were in talks to raise $50 million at a $500 million valuation for Uyala.
Well,
This was when, that year, I think we did $3 million in revenue, like crazy valuation. Uh, and then the world came to a stop with the financial crisis of October 2008. And so we went from thinking we were going to raise this huge round to not being able to raise for like the next year and a half. And that was hard. I mean, we ended up pitching over 173 investors. We received 170 no's until the 171st ended up investing in the company and saving the company.
no. Well, yeah. I can imagine that that period was really hard in terms of getting finance.
Oh,
And well,
it was a scary time. Scary, 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 scary time.
I can imagine. I can imagine. I want to get to another important topic, and is what is the secret to Wiseline's success? What do you think?
I mean, the people. It's obvious. Like any and all startups, it's the people, and then it's the culture, um, and then something else that I think is important is overall timing. But yeah, I'm a Sequoia as a venture capital fund doesn't agree with this general statement, but I'm a big believer in it's you invest first in people, then in markets, and then in the product. And so we because we were a product company that moved into services,
Mhm.
we kept a very high hiring bar on the people that we hired because that's how you hire on in product companies. And it ended up helping us in services because once we would go and sell to customers, people would be like, wow, the team you have is phenomenal. And I think of it as like the perfect intersection of EQ and IQ. Like incredibly smart people could also speak to customers and could empathize with customers, who could collaborate with teams from around the world to build great products. And they had a high quality bar of what they wanted and what they could achieve. And so I really think that the people aspect is important. Then you need to build a culture that gets the best out of people, right? Um, and we're trying to get back to this, but like I'm a big fan of hiring for potential. Like it's not about someone that's been doing the same thing for 10, 15 years and they're very good at doing that one thing. Especially when you're in a growth mode, you need people that are just going to excel and be able to rise to the occasion for whatever the company needs.
And how do you identify those people that you consider high potential?
So I'm a big fan of asking, uh, if I gave you $10 million right now, what company would you build? And the and it's never failed me. Like, the best people I've ever hired always had an answer. And it's because, like, they're always thinking of, like, how do I solve X, Y, and Z problem? Like, what is the potential of this opportunity? And some of these people, like, they were trying to solve, like, water scarcity in Ghana, right? Like, but they felt like if I had $10 million, this is the big problem that I would solve. And then for me, that always produced kind of the best people, because there is something about entrepreneurs. They want to learn, they want to work hard, because they eventually want to do it for themselves. Eventually, they want to go out and do something. And so, taking these entrepreneurs and making them entrepreneurs, I think they may not stay at the company very long. They may only stay at the company for 2 years, 3 years, and then they'll move on to do something else and solve other big problems. Maybe they'll start their own company. But while they're there, I mean, you're going to get 10,000% from them.
Okay. And how do you think that? Well, I agree with you that the most important thing is the team, as in everything, in basketball, in football. The important thing is the human talent. That's the, let's say, the most important resource that you have. But how can you attract like great people? Do you think that because you already because you worked at Google, because you founded Uyala, that was a big company, that was the key, or what
Uh,
was it?
I think it needs to be passion, right? Like, when I left Uyala, and this is something that I think everybody, like, eventually understands. Like, everybody has an expiration date, even if it's the company you started. And the reality is, I stayed beyond my expiration date at Uyala. I probably should have left 2 years earlier. Um, so when I left, and Uyala was still running and it was going to be acquired by Telstra, I started hiring people, and some people from Uyala. And so obviously the Uyala team was really upset. And then, even though we were a small company and Uyala was bigger and could offer better salaries, like, I was personally attending the recruiting events. I was personally recruiting. And so I think people want to see their leaders in the trenches with them. And so in the early days, I think that was really important. And there wasn't anything that I would ask of anybody else that I wasn't willing to do myself. Now, um, I stopped programming early in my career, like when I was 22, 23. So I don't think any engineer would ask me to do a pull request and then a code commit, because then they'd be like, "Wow, your code is shit." But everything else, I'm willing to do everything.
Awesome. And that is connected with one point that is important for Wizeline. Wizeline wants its employees to be entrepreneurial. What does an entrepreneurial employee look like? What entrepreneurship and innovation opportunities do Wizeline's employees have?
Um, so I think I've seen some that have started companies and they've moved on, and I've personally invested in the company, and other executives have invested in their company. Um, but I do think that we need more entrepreneurship, right? Like, sometimes someone will approach me and say, "Hey, I have this idea. I'd like to work on this 100% of the time." I'm like, "We have work to do. Like, if you're really passionate about this, like, work on it nights and weekends, then bring me something that I can actually say, wow, this is really cool." and then that could become your day job. And everybody talks about the 20% time, or at least people used to talk about 20% time at Google, and people assume that like Friday out of the week, individuals would have the ability to work on their own pet projects. The reality was, because the company was growing so fast, everybody was working 7 days a week. And maybe from like 8 p.m. on Saturday until like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, they'd be like, hey, I have this like idea. Let me work on it. And that was considered the kind of their 20% time. But if they came up with like a little prototype, then they brought it to Larry, Sergey, and Eric. Larry and Sergey, the founders, and then Eric Schmidt was the CEO. If they found it interesting, they'd be like, "Hey, you know what? We'll speak to your boss and get you off that project, and you can focus on working on this thing. Come back in 3 weeks and show us kind of that next milestone." Then he would come, or she would come and show that next milestone. And if they achieved what they thought they were going to achieve, then they would be given 2 additional people to work on the project. And then they would have a milestone. And usually most projects died at that phase. It's like it wasn't going to be a big enough opportunity. Some of those people said, you know what, this may not be big enough for Google, but it could be a big business outside of Google. And they would leave with those 2 people and they would go and start that business.
And could you maybe give us an example about an employee at Wizeline that you say, okay, this person was very entrepreneurial? Like, how
So there
does
have
it
been
look
a
like?
handful of companies that have started from former Wizeliners. So obviously, Salud came out of Wizeline. Serbi, which is a security company, co-founded by our former CTO. My younger brother was also the founder of Uyala.
What
His
example do
company.
you have for a person that's just starting at Wizeline and it's in a low level? Let's say they have just 1 or 2 years of experience working out of college. They start working at Wizeline. How can they be entrepreneurial? And how do you see that?
Uh, so the nice thing about Wizeline, can you hear me?
Yes.
The nice thing about Wizeline is that we work with hundreds of companies from around the world, and many times you'll see it's like, look, here are all these newspaper companies that have the same problem. And Wiseline's business model is like usually we rebuild the same thing multiple times. And that's how Serbi was created. One of our big customers came to us and said, I have this problem. Can you help us solve it? And we quoted them a price. They didn't want to build it and own it. And that looked like a really big opportunity. And Vidal and Belsasar went and started that company. And so like as an entrepreneur, a services company is really interesting because you get to see so many problems that can and should be solved.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And Wizeliners that are just starting or that are early in their careers, I think this is a great advice for them on how to become an entrepreneurial inside the company. I have
Yeah,
another
that's
question.
also what I usually tell like recent grads. It's like go work at a fast growing company because as a consumer, you may have a lot of B2C ideas, but because you haven't worked in a business setting, you may not have any ideas of like what big companies who are willing to pay something are willing to pay for.
Yeah, that's a good point. And well, I want to understand better what's it like to be a big entrepreneur like you. What does a normal day look like for you? What routines do you have as an entrepreneur, Bismarck?
I get up early, so I usually get up between 4 and 5. Uh, Usually respond to emails, do like push-ups, sit-ups, then go get my wife's coffee if I'm at home. Usually I'm traveling, but if I'm home, go and get my wife's latte from Starbucks because they open at 5 a.m. And then I come back and I go for a run. So I usually run between 6 and 9 miles. Come back. If I don't have any meetings at 7 a.m., then I try to make breakfast and take the kids to school. And then my meetings usually start at 8, and sometimes they go until dinners at 9, 10 o'clock at night. Then if I'm not at a dinner, I try to have dinner with the kids, and then work and watch a Netflix show with my wife. But these days, given that we have a global presence at Wizeline, I'm usually at a Wizeline office 2 to 3 days every week. So I was in Colombia a couple of weeks ago. I was in Monterrey last week, and then Mexico City. And so I spend a lot of time on planes.
Understood. Uh, One last question, Bismarck. How did you learn about entrepreneurship, and how do you keep learning about entrepreneurship? Do you have any? Do you read books? Do you take courses? What's that secret?
I listen to a lot of podcasts, and a little bit, going back to this idea that you learn a lot by being in a business. Um, I love this podcast called Business Wars, where they usually talk about two different companies competing for a certain part of the business. And so I learn a lot. Like right now, I'm learning about Walgreens and CVS and how both of them grew up. And so you initially get the startup founder story, but then you also see the scale and what they did. So that's typically what I do to learn.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I think that what you learn in the university is not enough. And sometimes people that study business or that study business related topics, that they tend to become overconfident and that they know everything. That's something that happened to me. So I think it's always good to to learn more about how to learn about entrepreneurship and continuously do that. And the last question, Bismarck, what is the secret to your success as an entrepreneur? Is your mindset important? Is the mindset?
I think part of the mindset, I can't imagine. I am a positive person. Like I can't imagine that if I weren't, I would be a success. But I also just work hard. Like, and I stay positive because I work really, really hard. And if things don't work out, then sometimes things don't work out. But it wasn't because of lack of trying.
Okay, perfect. Well, Bismarck, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope that me as an entrepreneur and every people interested in entrepreneurship that listens to this episode learn and take this wonderful opportunity to learn from such a successful entrepreneur as you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye, Bismarck.